So, good morning to everyone that's joining us today. I am Rafaela Lipschitz, and I'm an associate analyst here at the New Lines Institute, where I work on our crime conflict nexus portfolio. And I'm so excited today to be moderating our panel on organized crime in Latin America as we launch our new Mafiacracies project. So, in this panel, we're here to examine how criminal networks are shaping security and governance across Latin America, a question that has taken on renewed urgency in the current political moment. The Trump administration has made Western Hemisphere security a cornerstone of its national security strategy, with a particular and very explicit emphasis on combating cartels and criminal networks. And even as US attention is pulled towards the war with Iran, we're still seeing active American engagement in Latin America to counter these criminal groups. And this signals just how central this region is to this administration's security agenda. Now, the region is home to some of the world's most powerful and adaptable criminal organizations. Many of these networks have proven adept at exploiting state fragility, corrupting institutions, and embedding themselves into local economies in ways that make them really difficult to fully dismantle. And the US policy response, however forceful it might be, is landing on a landscape that looks very different from country to country. So this context sets the stage for what is honestly a lot of ground to cover in just over an hour. So to sort of frame this discussion, we'll primarily be looking at how the US is framing its policy and strategy towards organized crime in the region, what emerging trends we're seeing on the ground, how criminal networks might be adapting to this intensified pressure. We'll be taking a deeper look at how a few specific countries in the region are navigating that pressure, and ultimately what the US and regional governments can actually do to effectively confront this vast and very complex criminal landscape. And to help us work through all of this, I'm joined by a great lineup of experts today who bring deep regional knowledge and diverse perspectives to help us answer these questions. We have Stefano Ritondale, who is a Mexican cartel expert and the chief intelligence officer of Artorias, a company specializing in intelligence analysis and geopolitical risk insights. Stefano is also the founder and operator of All Source News, an online investigative platform dedicated to monitoring and analyze Mexican cartel activity and cross-border security trends. We have Dr. Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera. Guadalupe is a professor in the Shah School of Policy and Government and co-director of the Corruption, Networks, and Transnational Crime Research Center at George Mason University. Her areas of expertise are border studies, US-Mexico relations, migration studies, and illicit networks. We have Dr. Will Freeman, who is a fellow for Latin America Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. His work focuses on the rule of law, corruption, and organized crime in Latin America, as well as US-Latin America relations. And prior to joining CFR, Dr. Freeman was a Fulbright Hays Scholar in Colombia, Peru, and Guatemala. And last but not least, we have James Bosworth. James is the founder of Hexagon, a company that provides political risk analysis in emerging markets. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center's Latin America program. He's the author of the Latin America Risk Report newsletter and has a weekly column in the World Politics Review. For the past 2 decades, James has written extensively about politics, economics, security, and technology in emerging markets, primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And just a reminder for anyone looking for translation, you can get that by hitting the More option at the bottom of your screen and selecting Spanish interpretation. So I want to get started with a question for all four of you, just to help us frame this new, what seems like a new US approach to organized crime in the region. We're seeing a fusion between counterterrorism frameworks and counter-cartel frameworks. We have the FTO designations, the National Security Strategy, and the recent Shield of Americas summit where Trump said, just as we formed the coalition to eradicate ISIS in the Middle East, we must now do the same to eradicate cartels at home. But what does framing criminal networks as terrorist organizations actually change in terms of how the US and regional governments fight them? Is it mainly about the tools that are available, the strategies that get prioritized, who ultimately bears the cost? So yeah, I'd love to hear from all four on you on that. Maybe we can start with Will and then jump to Guadalupe, then James, and then Stefano.
Sure, thanks, Rafaela. And hi, good morning, everyone. Good to be here. So, briefly, how do I see it? I mean, first, I think that what I see is the welcome parts of the new strategy, or where I see things moving in a positive direction, is the prioritization that this issue is given in the national security strategy. I think it's long overdue that the Western Hemisphere occupied one of the top places or the top places in that document, and not only in that document, but also in the way that the administration approaches the world. I am quite concerned that we're seeing a shift away from that with the war in Iran, that once again we're seeing the United States pulled into a war that it cannot even justify to the US people how this bears on our security interests, right? Where with organized crime, that's quite obvious. We've had over 300,000 Americans die from fentanyl in the last 10 years. Of course, huge violence in Mexico, massive changes to the way the Mexican state works, which has so many implications for our border and for the United States. But I think the prioritization is the positive part. I also think that the FTO designations, they cut both ways. But the positive I see there is that my understanding is it has redirected resources and focus within the federal government. So Treasury, for instance, much more focused on investigating organized crime financing now than it was before because of those designations. Another part that I see as positive here is the way that the Trump administration has used pressure, which I think previous administrations have not been willing enough to do. Now, I think some of that pressure has not been put in a positive direction, or it's been used to essentially get performative results, takedowns of cartel figures who may or may not be that important to the overall business operations. But I think it also contributed to things like the Mexican government investigating the Huachicol Fiscal scandal or the fuel smuggling within the Mexican Navy. That's a very serious. I mean, that cuts to the heart of organized crime in Mexico, and I'm not sure that would be happening without U.S. pressure. So, having said all those things that I see as positive, what concerns me about the current approach? I think the actual implementation in many cases is quite disappointing. The main shift I'd say that we're seeing in U.S. counter-narcotics approach is simply towards more lethality, and lethality often directed towards the most replaceable parts of these organizations. For instance, the operators of the boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, to the extent that we believe that all of those operators are part of organized crime. So I think that there, you're seeing the Trump administration pulled in a different direction, which is away from seriousness towards a kind of performance of a fight against organized crime without fundamentally changing anything. And so I really see it as just an administration pulled in two different directions. And I'm not sure which one is going to win out. As time goes on, and especially with the war in Iran now distracting from this, I'm worried that we see the more serious approach that could have developed sacrificed in exchange for big explosions, extraditions, or not even technically extraditions, extractions of certain crime figures, and an absence of real investigations on either from the United States side or from the region. But let's see, I don't want to write it off too soon.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, and thanks to the New Lines Institute for organizing this important event on very important subjects and very important regions. All of them are important, but this is a region that matters to us, the Western Hemisphere, the national security strategy. And I agree with Dr. Freeman about the fact that the Western Hemisphere is and has been, a central part of U.S. national security strategy. However, in November of last year, we thought this was going to be the central region and the central focus. At the same time, the framing of that strategy and the counter cartel strategy or framing of this. What is a cartel? And I insist that in every single forum that I am at. What are you talking about when we're talking about cartels? Definitely, Latin America is the most violent region in the world, and some of the countries are living very complicated situations in this sense. The country where I was born and raised, Mexico, has enormous problems in that regard. And I can think about different regions of Latin America and the Caribbean that are really absorbed by the presence of the groups, human smuggling, human trafficking, drug trafficking, violence related to extortion, and of course, what you call fiscal, which is, fuel smuggling and all that. We need to solve this in a way that we all cooperate to deal with this. Definitely. That's not a question. But what is happening today? And how are we going to do that? How are we going to trust each other when corruption is a central part of this? And what cartels are? Cartels are not organizations that are consolidated in a central structure and led by bad guys like El Chapo Guzman or El Mencho, who was assassinated recently. We're really talking about complex networks or networks in a very complex system, complex adaptive systems, and networks that are formed by different actors that operate in licit and illicit spaces. So we cannot say that we're going to go after these these entities that do not exist in reality. We have to deal with corruption, and these networks operate because of corruption networks as well, because of political protection of governments at different levels. And that is not going to be solved by sending the Department of War or the Department of War sending drones or bombing what? I mean, we have to reconceptualize this matter. The shield of the Americas. What are you shielding from, and who is going to build shielding from what? Is that using the countries that are in the same line of the United States to shield the United States from the consequences of a war in a different part in the Middle East, for example? Or is this shield a real shield to really address these issues in a way that it's going to help? Of course, the pressure of the United States against these organizations or these complex networks will probably be a pressure to deal with these. And some people are going to think twice about this when they think about the US military and this collaboration. But there's no plan. There's no strategy that kind of like come up with a way to deal with this at the different level. This is a multidimensional problem that requires multidimensional solutions that have to do with the fighting against corruption, with financial intelligence, of course, with law enforcement measures that have to do with a transnational issue. But there's also a social issue and an issue of drug consumption, for example. And not everything is about drug trafficking. We have a lot of things that are connected with drug trafficking groups. And some of these groups don't dedicate themselves to drug trafficking. They dedicate themselves to charge money for the passage of migrants because they control a territory. But these people don't know who are the people that are bringing the precursors from Asia and are producing these substances in the Mexican territories. And some of them don't even connect with those that transport them. They have businesses with them. So we have to understand that to dismantle these networks, we have to dismantle corruption first that allows these things to happen. And that needs to be done, transnationally, with transnational cooperation. The Department of War alone and presenting this as a strategy to fight cartels is not going to address the issue in any form. We have seen that. We have seen the Latin American governments, the Guatemalan government, the Colombian government, and the Mexican government, Garci, the Merida Initiative, and all these programs that have pressured the governments to collaborate with the United States in a military form have not addressed these issues without this comprehensive strategy. And now this comprehensive strategy needs to involve all countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm just going to build on what was already said and try to leave something for Stefano to say as well, as we push forward. But to sort of look at the question here, we've moved from this counter cartel strategy to a foreign terrorist organization. Can we address organized crime in Latin America as the same way we used to address foreign terrorist organizations, or we still do? And, I mean, interestingly, the commander of U.S. Southern Command gave the posture statement yesterday to the U.S. Congress. And in it, he sort of refers at the opening to foreign terrorist organizations. And it takes us back to 2005 when the commander of Southern Command often referred to foreign terrorist organizations, but they're referring to Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and trying to like tie Latin America and the Caribbean to foreign terror, to the global war on terror at the time. There's a critical difference between organized crime in Latin America and foreign terrorist organizations. And part of this is that organized crime or crime in Latin America, violent crime in Latin America, sort of has two dynamics, right? One is a market-driven dynamic, right? Whether that is from drugs or migrants or weapons or whatever the illicit gold, whatever the product is that they're moving, there's a market and there's a demand for it, and they're filling a demand. And that's very different from dealing with the question of ideologically based terrorism. The second issue is that some of the organized crime exists as opportunity-based because of weak institutions, and that can occur in terms of extortion. It can also occur in terms of state-sponsored organized crime, things like the way that the Venezuelan government did and does engage in state-sponsored crime in order to finance itself. And none of dealing with a foreign terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda goes at those two questions of market demand and the sort of lack of institutionality in Latin America. If we deal with crime as a group, you can dismantle and destroy groups. You can take out high value targets, and it doesn't dismantle the criminal structure, as has been mentioned here before, right? And to give two examples, Enrique Peña Nieto, when he came into office, promised to take out 125 high value targets, and by the time he was done 6 years later, he had taken out over 100 of them. And Mexican crime went up, right? And we've gone from 7 groups in Mexico, basically, to several hundred groups in Mexico as the groups have disintegrated, become smaller. And you do get the super groups, right? The CJNG, the ELN in Colombia. You have these big groups, and there's a reason for US policy to potentially say we should take out the big groups because the big groups are systemic threats to the US in various ways, and they're systemic threats to the various countries across Latin America in ways. But taking out the big groups doesn't take out the criminal system. It simply just sort of breaks down the groups and rearranges the groups. And we don't defeat organized crime by taking out the groups. And the problem with dealing with this as foreign terrorist organizations is you deal with the organizations, but you don't deal with the problem. But with that, I'll pass it on.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the speakers for all the points you brought up. Just to kind of put in my 2 cents on this. I think what the problem we're running into is, I mean, from the foreign terrorist designation, yes, there is additional authorities that does give the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. military in certain aspects, specifically the intelligence law enforcement, but it's also a messaging component. And I think one of the aspects from a messaging issue is that we are seeing right now a swing to the right across kind of generally in South America. And a lot of this is kind of based on the framing of how these gangs, organized crimes, and cartels are bringing message almost in a similar aspect to terrorists, right? This isn't just a Trump talking point. We are seeing this across Latin America. But if I may, with James' perspective, I think there's a if we're analyzing it, for example, from the U.S. and Latin America, and even specifically in Mexico, I think there's some common aspects where both countries and both areas might see similarities in how they deal with cartels, but there's also a difference, right? In some aspects, the United States views the primary threat to itself as these drug trafficking organizations because the drugs, either migrants or oil or others. And a lot of times in these South American countries, it's more related to the violence they might do. And that's kind of the aspect where these criminal organizations have kind of gone towards tends, at least in specifically these cartels, to militarize themselves a lot more, and where this aspect of territorial control has become center aspects in their ability to push products and that transactional component, which requires them to become much more militarized in how they operate and in their business model. And the violence aspect is a much more greater concern for countries in South America. And that's why you might see differences in how these countries address the issues. In Mexico, for example, you have instances where the government might target violently one group, and in others, they just enable them to exist because they realize that they don't want violence to go up. Dr. Correa alluded to also corruption, which kind of convolutes and complicates the issue. And I think that's the fundamental issue that the problem set is that the United States is obviously going to take a much more hard stance approach, either from a law enforcement perspective or a military perspective, because in their view, this is how they can reduce the threat that's going in. And some of these South American countries might be more concerned about violence. And depending on the political leanings, where we're now seeing this right-wing focus in addressing these criminal groups as terrorist organizations because of the militarized approach that they're taking and how they solidify their territorial control and the business that they do into the United States. So in some areas, in some countries, you're going to see similarities. I think Ecuador, for example, with Los Lobos y Los Choneros, who are both declared foreign terrorist organizations, you're seeing President Noboa being very close-knit with the U.S. foreign policy and encouraging and really promoting these joint U.S. military operations against these groups. But in Mexico, for example, it's a little bit more convoluted and complex, where the Mexican government, at least publicly, tries to make sure, hey, we don't want unilateral military operations. But in the back end, what we're seeing is an extensive expansion of bilateral cooperations between the United States and Mexico. And even in that area, it's a little bit more convoluted because there was a phenomenal report in Reforma that indicated that the Mexican operation that killed El Mencho, the leader of CDNG, the president of Mexico might not have been made aware of that operation until the operation happened. And this goes back to maybe a conversation we're going to have about the, U.S. military approach, let's say in Mexico. It expands on the idea of these vetted units that the U.S. has. And in many aspects, these units are Mexican, they're Mexican-owned, Mexican-led. They just receive intelligence funding from the U.S. But in many ways, this is a tool that the U.S. government has to launch operations without necessarily deploying U.S. military force. And I'll end with this. I know a lot of people are talking about Iran. I just have to make this clear. If we're dealing about cartels, we don't need two carrier strike groups to do this. We don't even need a carrier strike group. The U.S. military can walk and chew gun at the same time, and we are able to operate in the Western Hemisphere with a different military footprint than we are enabled to the Middle East. And one of the beautiful things about the Western Hemisphere is right next to us. From a logistical standpoint, it's significantly easier to do these operations. So although the Middle East is the focus right now, and from a U.S. military perspective, we have to be cognizant that the U.S. military can operate very effectively in South America. And as alluded to in the Mexico case, a lot of times we don't even need our own military force to do it. We can rely on our partners there.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. That was, I think, a great way to get this conversation started. And I want to draw on what I think most of you said at some point, and Stefano especially, the sort of swing to the right that we're seeing. And we focused on the US approach and the US militarized approach to these groups. But Will, a question for you, I guess. How different is this for countries in the region? Regional governments have long oscillated between military crackdowns and negotiated or social approaches to organized crime, whether that's, total peace or hugs not bullets, initiatives like that, which seem to have now largely faded out. So the pendulum seems to be swinging back towards the kinetic and military side. Are we now just in the sort of familiar cycle of this pendulum swing, or is there something genuinely different about how regional governments are approaching and militarizing the fight against criminal networks?
I think it is a return of an old strategy in many countries, but perhaps with a recognition, legitimation from the United States that it's never quite as fully received before, and that could have consequences. So I'll get into that in a moment. But first, I think just want to say I agree completely with the way the other speakers framed this as these, you can't simply eliminate organizations and therefore take care of the problem of organized crime. We think of these organizations as discrete from the state. They very much are intertwined with it and with the formal or illicit economy. But I guess just to try to put ourselves in the minds of the Trump administration, which I do think it's important to understand how they and their supporters got to this place. So I think what they would probably say is, look, we tried this for 20 years. We spent $1.5 billion on the Plan Merida. We spent about 500 million of that to assist the building of the Mexican judiciary. What happened in the end? You still have a Fiscalía General de la República in Mexico, the Attorney General's office, that has upwards of 90% impunity rates for homicide. You have a cover-up of Ayotzinapa, despite all the public pressure to solve those cases of disappearances. You have enough people disappeared, and just in the state of Jalisco, that if they were all to return, they could fill the entire lower bowl of the stadium, the massive stadium where the World Cup games are to be played. None of it's investigated seriously. So we spent $500 million that we could have been spending on schools and other services in the United States and things we need, and we threw it down the drain because there's not political will to change these things in Mexico and in many countries in the region. So I think that that's the cynical, jaded, and in some ways understandable approach of the Trump administration. And what they're saying is, because this hasn't worked and it's not going to work, we are going to go to the only tool that we think is available to us under our control, which is the US military, and then pushing countries in the region to also give us measurable results using their own militaries, right? Crime figures taken down, but labs busted, drugs seized, right? I'm not defending that approach. I'm just trying to explain how we got here because I think that that's important. So in terms of what this is bringing about in the region and how new it is, I agree with your assessment that it does seem that the approaches like total peace and hugs not bullets have passed away for now. I would something on that. I don't think that those approaches were totally misguided. So even in, before this, we've seen relatively successful negotiations in Latin America with essentially organized crime groups that made real improvements. And I'll talk about this later, but the case of the demobilization of the paramilitaries in Colombia and the subsequent investigations of their ties to politics, for me, that's probably the best example we have of seriously weakening sort of paramilitarized organized crime. So we saw this sort of more negotiated social approach, whatever you'd like to call it. We've seen alternatives to militarization used before, and I think these most recent ones had something logical about them, right? So what was AMLO really saying? I think his most generous interpretation was he was saying, if we don't stop recruitment by giving youth other more attractive options, you're never going to defeat these groups. What was Petro saying? He was saying, unless we negotiate with them, they're going to always have the financing and the armed capacity to resist us and cause violence. So those were not ridiculous ideas, but I think in practice, they were implemented in ways that delegitimated them, right? So you had pullbacks of military pressure accompanying these approaches in both those countries and some others. And that allowed for criminal groups to recruit more, to expand territorially, to overall increase their power. So now we're seeing populations across the region, I think, very skeptical of that. And they want, in most cases, a swing back to, it's the same as the Trump administration. Show me the results, right? Give me some kind of visible kinetic action that suggests that the state's going after crime. How is that changing? How's it different than before? And I'll end here. I think that, as I said, mostly for me, this is a return to the past. We've already seen this tried in Mexico, right, before under Felipe Calderón and parts of Peña Nieto. We've seen it at times in other countries. I think the real difference is by without a real legal basis or I think, completely affirmative intelligence identifying their targets, the Trump administration going and killing 150 people in the Caribbean and the Pacific, that's really changed the permission structure. And I think we're already seeing the results of that somewhere like Ecuador. So Ecuador just bombed, it seems, a border area with Colombia, perhaps causing casualties on the Colombian side. That's quite a bit more, that's militarization, but that's a very aggressive turn in militarization. So I think we're seeing, and we may see other governments do this as well, but even when they've militarized in the past, perhaps there were some guardrails. I think the Trump administration incentivizing and validating this approach so strongly has, in some sense, relaxed those guardrails, and we'll see what the consequences of that are. Finally, I'll just say that I think the biggest risk with militarization and the turn we're seeing now is that it becomes an excuse for countries not to fix those problems of impunity that I started this response talking about. So if Mexico is showing enough results using its military to satisfy the Trump administration, if it's getting enough elementos, right? Maybe then we don't see anything change in the Fiscalia, in the prosecutor's office. If we're seeing enough fentanyl labs busted, maybe we're not going to see the government will have an excuse not to really get control of the ports, which, by the way, in Mexico are still under military administration since AMLO. So I think that those are all risks. There's the risk that the power of the army vis-a-vis civilians becomes highly inflated. So even if then the military is doing a bad job on these issues, civilians struggle to get power and real decision-making control back, which is also, again, I keep saying Mexico, but this is another dynamic we're seeing there. So I'll end there, but I think just to, in summary, this is a return to something we've seen in the past, now with greater permission, the permission structure expanded, and there are the same risks as there have always been, perhaps now in even more places.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Will. And James, over to you. You mentioned Venezuela, obviously, and the state-embedded criminality that we're seeing there. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that and Trump's approach. We've seen the Trump administration engage heavily with figures like Delcy Rodriguez and others that have long been associated with state-embedded criminal networks in Venezuela, or the so-called, Cartel de los Soles. But the administration has also been signaling that opening Venezuela up to US economic interests is now the priority. So given that, what are the realistic prospects for dismantling this state-embedded criminality? And does the economic opening maybe create leverage that could eventually be used to address that criminality? Or do you think it will ultimately consolidate it?
No, thanks. And that is a multi-billion-dollar question for Venezuela at the moment. Let me talk about the Cartel de los Soles, right? Because we call it the Cartel de los Soles, right? It's a term that comes from the media and from the U.S. intelligence community and was actually put into a U.S. indictment of Nicolas Maduro and then later withdrawn. There's not a cartel in the sense of the cartel de Sinaloa, right? Or, there's not an org chart. The people who are members, who we consider members of the Cartel de los Soles, don't call themselves the head of the cartel, right? It's sort of a shorthand for how we refer to the Venezuelan state criminal structures that exist, because it's true that there are high-ranking members of the Venezuelan military who engage in drug trafficking, in the trafficking of illicit gold, in the trafficking of people, and in mass corruption in terms of how they move oil, in terms of how they use the ghost fleets around the world to profit from that, and then how they launder the money, right? And there's major money laundering scandals across the world, in Russia, in Switzerland, in the UK, in Spain, in Costa Rica, in Mexico, all involving Venezuelan money flowing through, not to mention the entire property sector in southern Florida, where a number of the testaferros for key Venezuelan corrupt officials moved their money and bought property. And so that's an issue the United States should probably deal with. So, we took down the head of the Cartel de los Soles, Nicolas Maduro, or who we call the head of it, and Insight Crime, which does some really good investigations on Venezuela. They had a great headline, which is "The King is Dead, Long Live the Queen," because Delcy Rodriguez is now the head of the Cartel de los Soles. But the difference being that instead of indicting her, the United States is working with her. She's now Donald Trump's best friend. And I think that is a real challenge for U.S. policy, and the credibility for U.S. policy in the region is that the United States made an entire case about going after Nicolas Maduro because he was involved in drug trafficking and corruption and crime, labeled him as the head of an organized crime organization, and then put his personal deputy, who he named, we're negotiating with. We criticized AMLO for hugs, not bullets. We criticized Petro for total peace and negotiating with the criminal groups. And we're negotiating with the top person of the Cartel de los Soles now and working with that person to move oil from Venezuela into the United States. And through many of the same networks, not all of the same networks, but many of the same networks that were used under the Maduro regime. And yes, they got rid of Alex Saab. They've mostly eliminated Carretero's oil trafficking networks, but Alejandro Betancourt still, he's in house arrest in the UK, but he owns an oil patch in Venezuela. We've basically chosen the winners and losers of the organized crime fight in Venezuela, arrested some of them, and allowed other of them to continue operating. For me, this is, is there an opening for leverage? Potentially, but right this second, to me, it looks like the United States government is working with a criminal organization, with somebody who we've designated as a criminal organization, who we've designated as a foreign terrorist organization under U.S. law, but we're sort of sweeping it aside because it's convenient. And, if there's a credibility gap right now in terms of U.S. policy and organized crime, it's this one. It's not necessarily that we're working with Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, which has its own set of problems. It's not other corruption issues. It's that we pivoted on a dime in Venezuela from calling it an organized crime regime to now working with it, and we haven't explained that policy.
Great, thanks, James. And yes, I totally agree with that assessment. And I want to jump now quickly, if we can, to Mexico, just so by the end we've sort of covered the countries that keep coming up in this discussion. We've spoken a bit about El Mencho and whether that's a success or whether that's not a success. Guadalupe, his death ultimately brings back into the discussion the kingpin strategy, which has, been a strategy that has persisted for decades, despite having very sort of mixed evidence of its success. Why do you think it endures then? Is it because it's, an obvious political win, as we've been speaking about? Is it because despite having some issues, it sometimes does work? Or is there just not a better option available?
Well, This is a very important discussion that many analysts and policymakers over, in the Western Hemisphere have had. We have been dealing with the kingpin strategy since the creation of the DEA and since the war on drugs declared by former President Richard Nixon. The reality is that there are no mixed results in this, particularly in the case of Mexico. As we know, and this is very difficult for me to understand, why we insist in dealing with what are so-called cartels, focusing on the leaders of these organizations that I call networks, that we should call networks. The problem is that we have seen that after going after one drug trafficker, drug lord, we have a moment of extreme levels of violence, immediate or in the near future. We have this reaction because of the reorganization of these groups that are led by these people. Of course, I'm talking about networks, but there are regional leaderships. These regional leaderships are lost, and we see the reactions by the same people of the organization or other groups that are fighting for the control of the plazas or the territories. That's the story that we have seen over and over and over. And the story that we have seen, the results is that we have a new leadership, and there is a adaptation of these part of the network in a moment before the militarization of the security strategy in Mexico, because we are talking about Mexico. Before the militarization of the security strategy under the Merida Initiative, we saw that this reorganization didn't do anything. We just saw new leaders, and there was an order that was connected with the PRI regime. At this point, we see the same reorganization, but we see an adaptation. It's really even more complex to see. And also the thinking here and the framing of this issue and the kingpin strategy is wrong and flawed, because there's an assumption that these groups just work in Mexico or led by Mexican people. And we're dealing with corruption networks that are also in the United States of America and other parts of the hemisphere and the world. So how are you going to deal with a very complex system that involves many more actors and corruption, even in the United States? How drugs are distributed, how they get to consumers, how they enter the United States, and the complexity in the distribution of the drugs. For example, if we assume that we're talking about drug lords or we're talking about drug markets, and this is why this doesn't make sense. So why the kingpin strategy is framed the way it has been framed? We have seen the DEA and the Department of Justice framing this in the different reports year by year, and the same strategy being done in this way. No results whatsoever. No results because of the drug consumption, the availability of drugs, and the more sophistication of the distribution channels within the United States. And everything has failed. In my assessment of the kingpin strategy, it's not that we have mixed results. It was that we have really no results, and even a more complex situation where the adaptations has made these organizations entering into different different markets and continuing and adapting. So that is a problem. And I don't understand why El Mencho's assassination was framed and was presented as a big success of the Mexican government in collaboration with the United States of America. Like in Venezuela, we kind of maintain the same structure, the same lines of financing and money laundering channels, corruption we maintain intact the network. And this is why we have to think about networks, because we have to find the nodes, we have to find the connections between the nodes, and we have to dismantle them, getting to the nodes and understanding how the connections, so we can take them out and dismantle them, and just not going after one particular person in one of the nodes, and the node reorganizes and adapts to each other. So El Mencho's assassination, even though it has been presented as a big win, we saw the result immediately. We saw the result with El Mayo Zambada and El Chapito in 2024, and we saw what happened in the state of Sinaloa. When we don't address this in the political side and on both sides of the border and even beyond, because there are connections that go beyond Mexico and the United States. So I think the kingpin strategy and El Mencho's assassination is just a big failure. And if we don't learn from the experience that we have had in the past few decades, we will never address this problem correctly. And if we don't deal with the issue of drug consumption as public health issue, of course, combined with with the other areas that explain this complex system, we're not going to deal with the violence and with the other the diversification of criminal activities.
Thanks so much, Guadalupe. And I want to explore that a bit further, specifically looking at these sort of leadership dynamics and potential consequences of this. And Stefano, you've been doing, great work sort of tracking the CJNG's leadership structures and what we should be looking for. I'm wondering if you can explain some of that to us. What is it looking like right now? Is it looking like they will be able to sort of coalesce behind a single leader, or is it looking like there could be, as Guadalupe mentioned, this Sinaloa type fracture where we see Mayo Zambada extradited and then fragmentation and just ultimately an escalation of violence? What have you been seeing so far?
Yeah. If I may, before I address that, I think, though, I want to really hone in on something that Dr. Correa, because she brings up a good point, but I think this is where it goes back to my original point, is specifically in the U.S. and the Mexico side, the difference. And I think we just need to be adamant and say that no U.S. government cares about the violence inside of Mexico and if their action causes increased levels of violence. That is not a U.S. national security prerogative and is not a concern. The Sinaloa cartel civil war is not something that the Biden administration did that. They received no political pushback. They received no criticism. And if anything, they probably received more than praise. And the Trump administration probably took a note of that, and hence why the men show. And I think we just have to acknowledge that this is where there's a divergence between the U.S. and Mexico and how we view this problem set. Because if you look at the drop of fentanyl seizures across the border, it closely mirrors after the Sinaloa cartel civil war started, because Los Chapitos were one of the, although all of them were one of the main pushers of fentanyl into the United States, specifically Iván Echevardo. And so if you look at the data and you look at this, the U.S. administration is going to say, that's not a problem. That's not our problem. It's kind of what Will said. If Mexico can't solve 90% of your homicides, we're not going to solve it because that's not our country. That's not our problem. And I think it's just an uncomfortable truth that when we're having this conversation, what is going on? But another excellent point that they brought up from the financial aspect, and it goes to your question, Rafael, as Dr. Correa said, is the financial nodes. And then I think that's what we're seeing in this consolidation of the new leader, right? Based on my own sources, Arcon told me is, I think anybody who understands CJNG specifically is very familiar with Los Queenies, the Valencia Garcia family, right? They are the financial arm of CJNG, right? They're the brainchild of the Millennial Cartel. These are the people who run the money. And we've seen a lot of them be detained and captured. Abigail being one of them, El Queenie specific, who's right now in U.S. prison and being there. The interesting aspect is that the stepson of El Mencho, at 03, he is, based on what I'm hearing, he's the new leader of Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The interesting dynamic, though, you're running into is, to your point, of those regional commanders, what is their perspective? And right now, it does appear there is some coalescing around that, right? And the key ones to look at is, I'm just going to use their alias for simplicity's sake, is El Sapo, El Jardinero, El Doble R. Those are kind of like the three big major ones that can, if anybody can challenge that, it would be those three. There is a coalescing around that. But the interesting aspect now is, since 03 has been put in charge, his mother is of the Queenies. His mother is Valencia Gonzalez, right? They own the money. They control the money. And now you have a leader who is from the same family that controls the money and who also now controls the weapons. And that, I think, is a very interesting dynamic, because El Mencho was much more, at this point of the day, he wasn't running necessarily the day-to-day operations. He was more of a symbolic figure. He was revered by members of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, right? And he had that, for a lack of a better term, I'm just going to say it, aura. And they had this mass respect within the groups that he led in this founder. Now 03 being the stepson, which is now we're seeing an interesting dynamic where cartel leaders get captured and their sons are taking over, similar to Iran. And wow, the interesting aspect is How do they respond? Because now what we're seeing, the children of these cartel leaders are acting in broad senses. They need to make a name for themselves. Right? We saw it with Ivan Archibaldo and Los Chapitos as a whole. We specifically saw it with Mayito Flaco, the son of Mayo Zampada, where he went on a war path after his father was captured. And then the day after El Mencho was killed, over 28 Mexican National Guard soldiers were killed in retaliation. I mean, that's the bloodiest day for the Mexican National Guard, led by O3. So I think the issue we're running into is now that there is kind of a coalescing, at least in broad sense that we're seeing. They do understand that O3 has to be in charge. He is of the same family that controls the money aspect and all the money laundering. But the problem we're running into is if we were to remove every single dollar that Los Guinis ever made just for the Jalisco New Generation cartel outside of the Mexican financial market, the Mexican economy collapses overnight. Point blank, full stop, end of story. And this goes to your first question, right? Why is it the kingpin strategy? Why is it that not only the United States, but all these Latin American countries do the kingpin strategy? Because it's not only the US, Mexico does it all the time, every day. And the reason is because that's the only tool they have. If we go after the money, the U.S. has only sanctioned 3 major Mexican financial institutions in Mexico with a combined worth of around $15 billion. That's a joke. That's nothing. That's irrelevant. They're not going to go after the major financial systems because you can really run a risk of causing a significant economic crisis in Mexico. And oh, by the way, guess who actually has hard cash currency on hand, green dollars? The cartels. So that's number one. Number two, corruption. Absolutely. I think it's a safer question to ask who's not corrupt when we're having this conversation than who is corrupt, because the list is long. But the U.S. has zero interest, and all these other countries, there's no political will to necessarily change that. So that's why it's the kingpin strategy. And then the differentiation of the goals and the objectives specifically in Mexico is where the U.S., we don't care. We don't care if a big one fractures and breaks apart, from a U.S. national security perspective, I think that's the issue, that there's not that political change to do it. And this is the switch. And these groups and cartel members, from a drug consumption perspective, I mean, you can look at Michoacan, right? Michoacan, the violence is probably much more easily explained by avocado and lime trafficking into the U.S. And I think that's just kind of this dichotomy in the problem set, that's why we're very reliant on the kingpin strategy. But in Jalisco New Generation cartel, I'm not seeing yet a fracture. It's still fairly fresh. The Sinaloa cartel civil war only happened a couple of weeks, if not months, after the capture of Mayo Zambada. But there we continuously got reports of buildup of tension until actually executed. Right now, we haven't necessarily seen that. And if anything, specifically, it looks like CJNG is really going much more aggressive in some of their operations. And one of the key areas I'm looking at is Zacatecas, because there's a worrying trend in CJNG affiliated groups in Zacatecas using much more prevalent use of IEDs and even car bombs, targeting the Zacatecas State Police, because they accuse the Zacatecas State Police of working for their rivals, the Mayito Flacos. And so they're taking a much more hardline approach there. And I think O3, because he's the son, and we're seeing this, since he has to make a name for himself, since he has to prove himself, this is the direction he's going to go. And he's going to take a much more aggressive approach, as we saw with Mayito Flaco.
That's great. Thank you, Stefano. And just on that, and on the sort of armament and tactics that we're seeing, I think everyone was following quite closely in the immediate aftermath of El Mencho's death as to whether CJNG would sort of mobilize their drone units, which have gotten quite a lot of attention. And I think especially after the El Paso incident, the idea of cartels having drones, whether that's for smuggling and trafficking, whether that's for fighting, whether that's for ISR, has definitely gotten a lot of attention. Can you walk us through whether it's CJNG specifically or other cartels in the
they all use drones. They all use drones. I mean, I don't know. I know like CJNG. Okay, so to understand CJNG, they love the propaganda. Like they have the Mencho Special Forces, Grupo Elite, the elite group, Delta group. They love to use these nomenclatures just for propaganda perspective. It's something that's very common, but all cartels use drones. It's just widely, and even some that you probably never heard of, or most of our listeners never heard of. Los Ardilleros have used it. Los Telacos use it regularly. Carteles Unidos use it. Everybody uses drone. It's just now a fact of the matter and the fact of life. But when we're talking about drone use, it's more of dropping explosives from a drone. The thing that I guess a lot more from the military side, as to your point, and the weapon traffickers, and what we're trying to look at is the introduction of FPV use. For those, like recently we saw the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, for example, release a video of an FPV drone going at the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. That's kind of the example I would highlight. That still, we haven't seen wide distribution. We've seen isolated cases, but we haven't seen that widespread. But I just think that the drone usage has been widely accepted. And actually, what I would even say, there was a phenomenal report released earlier that kind of tracked the amount of drone usage. I don't remember right now on the top of my head which is the institution. I can tell you right now, they vastly account how much actual drone use is being utilized, because they relied on like Mexican media reports, and the Mexican media captures fractions and 1 or 2% of all the violent incidents that happen, specifically in these remote areas. Drone use is prevalent. It is every day, if not dozens of times a day across Mexico. It is common. It is here. It is now. The question is, what is next? And the one that I'm looking for next is the FPV drones and those types of capabilities.
Thanks, Stefano, for laying that out. That's very useful to know. James, I want to jump to you. We've been talking about cases like Maduro-run Venezuela, where there's, obviously direct opposition to US intervention. And then also we've spoken a bit about Mexico, where Scheinbaum, I think, Stefano, you mentioned it, must sort of balance US pressure with domestic concerns. But I'm curious, and we've discussed it briefly, what about cases where regional governments support US military assistance in fighting organized crime? I think Ecuador is the obvious example of that, where we've seen US assistance in targeting gangs, and Noboa seems to just be inviting more and continued US involvement in this fight. Does this type of relationship, one that's more collaborative, offer more opportunity for effectively addressing crime in Ecuador? And what are the risks that could potentially sour this relationship between the two countries?
No, thanks. That's a great question. I think Ecuador is sort of the dream example for the Trump administration right now, right? This is exactly what they want to see and what they hope more governments do. And so let's lay out, some of what's occurred here. First off, Ecuador for a long time had a U.S. forward operating location. It wasn't the base, but it was based out of the Manta airport and co-located with an Ecuadorian Air Force base, where we had a number of our own Air Force planes that operated and were able to surveil drug trafficking flights over the Eastern Pacific. And that was removed by President Rafael Correa a decade and a half, two decades ago. But having the U.S. military operating in Ecuador at the current levels is rather significant. It's sort of comparable to the Uribe years of Colombia, in terms of having advisors on the ground, operating almost inside of the operations, helping plan the operations, helping train the people up, and then as we saw a week and a half ago, the U.S. military dropped a bomb on a cartel camp at the request of the Noboa government. A few things going on here. First off, Noboa is a security populist, and he wants to attack the cartels. And there is some public opinion support for attacking the cartels. And Ecuadorian public opinion is not completely against the idea of the U.S. military killing cartel leaders. Actually, you see this across much of Latin America. While Latin American citizens don't want the U.S. military coming in and occupying the country, they don't want the U.S. military, invading their politician, implementing any sort of political issues. In Latin America, people are happy to see cartel leaders die. And then that's a popular thing for, it's not comfortable from a human rights perspective, or from, but many citizens are okay with the idea that somebody goes and kills a cartel leader, and they're actually okay if the U.S. military is the one doing it. So this doesn't have the widespread opposition that I think that some people may think in Ecuador. But Correa is using this politically, right? He wants this to be a major political win for him. At the same time, he has banned the main opposition party right this second in Ecuador. He lost a recent referendum to reopen to put a U.S. military base in Ecuador, and he's doing this despite losing that referendum, which suggests some questionable political issues from him. And I think that there's concern also with, we know that every time you have a ramp up against the cartels, there are abuses that occur, right? And we saw this in Ecuador, where several school children went missing near military bases and then were found in mass graves. And the Ecuadorian military appears to be the one guilty, right? And it's a small example, but those are the sorts of things that will sort of sour these missions over time. And as U.S. military collaborates, we need to have human rights protections in place. I mean, that's not something that the current, Secretary of Defense is very, very keen on, but we have to make sure that we're defending human rights, and that if our U.S. military sees a human rights abuse, that we report it. And are we going to do that in the current climate? It's not clear. Any mistake that occurs, whether it's accidentally causing conflict with Colombia, which would be an enormous error, or even just bombing the wrong site, which will occur. You will have errors as you operate over time, will degrade support over time. Latin American populations are willing to hypothetically support U.S. military operations at times, but if those operations turn out poorly, that support will drop south very quickly. And I think one of the risks here is that we're operating in Ecuador without a clear plan for a victory. It's not clear what President Noboa thinks he's going to do that will lead to a win. And what is our metric of success? Well, Noboa's, I take the point previously, right? The U.S. metrics of success may not be security in Ecuador, but Noboa's metrics of success has to be security in Ecuador. It cannot be how many cartel leaders he killed. And if Ecuador's security continues to decline, this will be a political failure for Noboa, and it could blow back on the United States and its operations both in Ecuador and across the region.
Great. Thank you so much, James. I'm going to unfortunately have to skip a few questions because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A at the end. But at the end of the panel, if we have some extra time, I'd love to be able to ask you guys those. But I guess in closing, I'd love to ask each of you, this is obviously a very difficult issue to confront. So I'm just going to ask you to point to one country, one policy, or even a moment, even if it's an imperfect one, in the region that offers a genuine template for what progress against organized crime looks like. What would that be? Why? And how can the US, if it can, emulate that policy? Will, let's start with you, then we can go to Stefano, Guadalupe, and then James.
Right. I'll explain Colombia, which is the most broken record response. We've all heard it, but I'll try to give a fresh spin on why that is. But first, just in response to one point from Stefano, very quickly, I agree with you that unfortunately, I also think most U.S. politicians don't care, right, about whether or not there's massive corruption in Mexico or other countries, whether or not there's violence from the strategies we use. But I think we should care, right? And we do care about the consequences. We care when fentanyl comes. We care when millions of people, many of whom were displaced at home, come to our border, right? So I think the challenge is connecting the symptoms we care about and those underlying causes. And if we were really in a moment where U.S. foreign policy was based on America first and based on domestic interest, the interests of the U.S. population first, we would put those issues front and center. We would not be engaged in Iran. We would not be being pulled back into a conflict on the other side of the earth that has almost no bearing directly on U.S. lives. So in terms of the example, why Colombia? So first of all, I think a lot of people say Colombia is the example, but they say it's the defeat of the FARC or the weakening of the FARC. Put that aside for a second. I don't think the FARC is an analogy for the organized crime networks we're seeing in other parts of the region today. Let's look instead at the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the AUC, or the paramilitary umbrella group that became even stronger than the FARC, I think, in the late 90s and early 2000s. So what did you have at that point in Colombia? You had a third of Congress with relationships with these paramilitary structures. You had the paramilitaries confiscating people's identity cards and voting for them in regional elections. You had governors who were running unopposed because paramilitaries had killed or pushed out their competitors in parts of the Caribbean coast. So this was really serious. I mean, this was a situation akin, I would say, even more dramatic than Mexico's today, but something in that direction. And what you had then in the 2000s into the early 2010s were two things. One, you had Álvaro Uribe, who himself had many people connected to paramilitaries in his orbit. Some even alleged that he was connected. You had him demobilizing the groups and then to some extent taking advantage of the trust, if you could call it, that they had in him and extraditing some of their leaders to the United States. And in parallel to that, you had an institution that was completely at loggerheads with him, the Supreme Court, maybe for political reasons, not because of organized crime, but you had the Supreme Court investigating all these politicians in Congress and ultimately arresting something like 60 of them, right? So an investigation of organized crime, political corruption on a scale I think we've seen in no other country. And the combined result of that was that you went from that situation I described in the early 2000s to a Colombia by the mid 2010s that was far less, still violent, but far less so, that didn't have that level of organized crime penetration of Congress, which did still have a successor to the paramilitaries, which today is very powerful, the Gaitanistas, but not on the level that you did in the early 2000s. So the lessons I take away from that are you need demobilization, you need negotiations with the top. I think it's unrealistic to expect that, for instance, the Brazilian state is going to overcome the PCC without some kind of deal. I know ideally that happens through a publicly, announced legal framework, as it did with the AUSAID demobilization in Colombia. But all of that's not enough if you don't have that third part, which is the investigation, thorough investigation of the political ties. I will say one thing, I'll end here. One thing was missing in Colombia, which is that the system never investigated the financing of the paramilitaries in a serious way. So it took care of the leadership to some extent. It took care of some demobilization of the base. It took care of some of the political ties. When they found 450 records of 450 bank accounts and 40,000 transactions with businesses in a parking garage in Medellin in 1998, the Parqueadero Padilla, that was never seriously investigated, right? So there were limitations here. Colombia is not perfect today, but it's the only country that I would say has gone deep into this and is to some extent come out.
Thank you very much, Rafaela. This has been a very interesting conversation. As Dr. Freeman was saying, that was my first case, and I will be a little bit controversial in this sense. But I had the opportunity to visit the country in 2015, 2016, 2017, and then 2023, 2024. And I'm going to talk about El Salvador. But I'm going to talk about El Salvador not from a dogmatic position and not from a way to say this is the recipe for success. I'm just telling you what I have seen, and I have talked to people. I like to talk to people to understand what is happening. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I conduct interviews. When I went to El Salvador in 2015 and 2016, there were places that we could not even, walk through. It was impossible. The extortion, the protection within the prison system. And I'm not saying that this is perfect today, and I don't know until when this is going to be working at some point. And what it took to get to the situation that some people are describing to me at this point is something that we need to talk about as well. However, it is true that the people who had thought that they will never return and you'll make a living in, let's say, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, now they're thinking about going back to El Salvador and buying a house for the retirement period of time. And there are some elements that we need to take into consideration. And I think it was a fight against corruption. It was enforcement, and also with all the things that we can criticize, the alleged pacts that were done with some members of the MS-13 and Barrio 18, the transnational gangs that we know about, and also the extreme violation of rights of people that for some people are considered criminals and they should be done. That I'm not going to discuss what should be done here because I don't live there and I was not affected by the extreme levels of violence. I didn't have to leave my country. However, there is something about that model that we need to take into consideration. Dealing with this with force, the mano dura policies never work in El Salvador, and we have to understand that. We don't know until when we're gonna see what we're seeing today, because if we don't address structurally the corruption, if we don't address structural corruption, if we don't try to adapt the people without opportunities, and we don't provide them with opportunities, this problem is gonna burst out again. It's not about a leader. It's not about a person. It's not about a hero, the hero that Latin Americans are trying to look always. Some savior. It's a model that will work today and will work in a sustained way. But it's true that right now, people can walk. I don't know. It should be mass surveillance.